You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
As always, it's great to be back behind the golden Dixie Heritage microphone and to bring you another episode of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. And our guest is Paul Angel. Paul Angel is my boss at TBR. He is the editor of the Barnes Review magazine. He's also the one who's responsible for TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour being TBR Radio Presents. Last year, I said, that's what I need to do. I said, I need to do 52 podcasts in the year 2018, one for each week, and we'll call it the Dixie Heritage Hour. When I told the idea to Paul Angel, he immediately said, well, let's make it a radio show. And so I went from being somebody who was going to do podcasts for free to somebody who was getting paid to do a radio show. And so I've been loving every minute of it. And I'm very grateful to Paul Angel for the opportunity to do this. And so thank you, Paul. In January, I became a contributing editor at the Barnes Review magazine. And so I'm working for Paul and with Paul in that regard as well. And Paul is also on the editorial staff at the American Free Press, where I've been privileged to be a writer. This week's interview is with Paul Angel, and I just want to say that Paul is somebody who I'll always be grateful to because he's given me some tremendous opportunities that without his faith in me, I don't know that I ever would have had. I know this, I definitely wouldn't have got a job at the HuffPost. For those of you who are reading today's Dixie Heritage letter, you see there's an article in there where the HuffPost editor was bragging that they now had a majority of non-white writers, that their number of Asian writers, Hispanic writers, black writers far outweighed their number of white writers, and also their entire editorial staff is composed of women. So the odds of a white man like myself getting a job at the HuffPost were basically zero. And so it's a good thing that Paul Angel chose to hire me at the Barnes Review. When I reached out to Paul, I was contemplating actually at the time I moved to Maryland, which is where the Barnes Review's office is. And I told Paul that if there was any position that I'd like to interview for it. And Paul told me then when I was not going to leave Florida, when I was going to stay here, he told me, he said, you know what? He said, we can make it work out for you to work for us and do it right there from your home in Florida. So again, I'm just very grateful to Paul Angel and for all the opportunities that he has given me. Without any further ado, we'll get into the interview with Paul Angel. Where the interview starts is Paul and I are discussing the Defending Dixie issue of the Barnes Review, which is the issue that came out in the fall of 2017. We'll start the interview there. What was the inspiration for you as an editor to do the Defending Dixie issue? Was it an issue that was planned, or was it an issue that kind of took on a life of its own? Or
Well, I have a bank of stories, and then what happens is I look at them and I think they're okay, and then other stories start to come in, and I'll say that's better than this one, so I'm going to run these 10, and I picked the best 10. But in this case, I was kind of pissed off, honestly, about the statue removal. And I had enough guys who had, for instance, we had Lachlan Seabrook. That was just fortuitous that we had made contact with him. We're selling his books. And so I asked Dave to interview him. Then we had Dave also, I think it was Dave, yeah. He does only interviews by email. But then we had Dave was down in New Orleans and he started talking to that New Orleans activist. So I had Dave interview him. I had John Friend interview you, right? Because I was looking at Dixie Heritage and there was a lot of stuff. And so that was actually half commission. And we wouldn't have gotten to that length of articles. I also had in my bank, I said, oh, look, here's a Civil War one, a Civil War one, a Civil War one. And then we had 3 or 4 older ones that I remember that I thought were really, really good. People really liked that Secret Empire article in that particular issue about the secret societies and the Masons and stuff. My Masons didn't like the story, but it was very interesting, the detail he had about the Rothschilds and the bankers and their involvement and the different chapters in the South. So that was just a must go. I had one on blockade runners, anything obscure that we had run in an old issue. And then we had Ray Goodwin's one about, was it rather tariffs or was it slavery, which I thought was important. So, we normally don't do one of that. It was a lot of work. It's been very popular. I've had a couple donations just to distribute that particular issue. But as I got to about page 40 or 50, that's when it started to say we're going to have to do a lot more on that. But generally, it was just our overall irritation with the pulling down of the statues and the graffiti on them and the vandalism here, because it's just a left thing. I mean, I saw a parallel between what I've been working on with the Germans and all these years about war guilt, and if your father fought for the Waffen-SS or was in the German military, he must have been an anti-Semite and a hater. And then I hear this stuff being talked about that Robert E. Lee had to have been horrible because he had slaves, and Jackson had to have been horrible. It's baloney. And so, I also thought it was a good opportunity for us to reach out to other groups that are in this particular movement. We haven't done a very good job on that because we don't have the staff, but we were able to solidify a relationship with the League of the South. We're trading ads now. Some other people, some other organizations that we haven't finalized any type of ad swaps and stuff with. We're very interested in this, but it's a whole market. I mean, the Civil War is of great interest to people, and it seemed like this was a way for us to get away from what we normally cover. So it was a little bit of everything, but I can't say I went out and said, we're going to do a big Dixie issue. I think it pretty much started when I started assembling the issue and realized in my bank of stories I had a lot of good Southern stuff. And then we commissioned a few along the way to fill it out.
John Friend had told me that you had told him to get a hold of me. The story that he told me at the time was that of the hundreds of publications that you either subscribed to or that landed on your desk every week, that you only read about 3 or 4 of them, and that Dixie Heritage was one of them.
That's correct.
And so how did Dixie Heritage manage to make the cut every week?
Dixie Heritage I liked because it's self-contained. Okay, these newsletters where I get, and there's 5 or 6 links to the stories. I link on the articles, and then I go to the website, and all of a sudden I get inundated with the website, and I never get back to the newsletter. And I always felt like a newsletter is a product, and it's informational. And you weren't interested in web hits on your website. You're interested in giving out a self-contained newsletter that could be read from start to finish and forwarded to others without having them to overly link to other websites to get the information. I thought it was well written. I like a lot of short items. I think they were really well researched. I thought you had a day-to-day, week-to-week blow-by-blow accounts of some of the different monument removals. And I would look at it, after reading it for 3 or 4 times, I realized that this was a much bigger thing than maybe we were even realizing, that this had to have been a coordinated effort by somebody, obviously on the left, to pull this down. And like I said, to pull all these statues down and to destroy this history and to convince all Southerners that they are awful, racist haters. Look, if in fact you must be a hater or hateful to have had, if your ancestor was fighting for the Confederate side, well, that means every single Southerner nearly today is hateful. And this is something they've been trying to portray about the South for such a long time, when in fact we all know the racial relations in the South were really a lot better, I think, than they were, say, in Boston, Massachusetts. I remember when there was school integration in Boston and some other racial incidents in Boston, that the people in the Northeast had never lived with black people. They didn't understand that there are good black people. They're not all people like the street level killers in Chicago, for gosh sakes. And then, of course, and we were doing this Defending Dixie issue, and it kind of segues out because I saw some of the names of people you mentioned and began to contact a few of those. I don't remember if you had mentioned Kelly Hoskins or not. That may have been Andrew Carrington Hitchcock, who was doing a radio show for us. It was just a well-researched and on-time newsletter. And it was professionally written and edited. That's why I also wanted to know if you wanted to write for us. And I didn't know much about you at the time that you had written. You've written how many books?
30. 30
books.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's prolific in our book. People talk and talk and talk in our business. I don't know if your listeners realize this or whatever, but when you can find somebody who's actually doing something and not just talking about doing something, that's a rare commodity in this business, because I've had guys that I've worked with, and I won't name names, they're very intelligent people. But one of the things they don't know how to do is get something done. So Dixie Heritage was coming out on schedule with vital information, interesting stuff, and you had supporters. You have incorporated your own advertising from other outlets to try to help pay for this. It looked like it was a real business, you know. Mm-hmm. And so when anybody can write 30 books and put it on a newsletter, and you're a pastor and still are, correct?
Yes.
You know, I mean, you got a lot of stuff going on, but you're well organized. And I just found that it was more valuable to me than most other of the email newsletters that I get, especially in this particular business. My point was this, as I said earlier, what they're trying to do to the people of the South is what they've done to the Germans after World War II. And there's a real parallel there. Not only do I believe that they're attempting, I don't think Southerners are going to fall for it. We're a little bigger. We're a little more diverse in some ways. But Germans are scared to speak out. And not only that, a lot of them, the younger generation, and by the way, nobody knows nothing. I'm sorry if anybody's listening for under 55, but you don't know anything until you're 55. I used to think it was 20. I used to think it was 35. I realize now that you don't know anything until you're 55, which is why a lot of the subscribers for the Barnes Review, and maybe your own publication, I'm not sure, are older. It's because they've been through a few things. They've suffered. Well, these Germans over there, the older ones kind of get it. They knew what was going on in World War II, but the younger generation has been beaten down so incessantly that I actually think when they see pictures of World War II, they get an automatic psychological response, a physiological response too, of guilt. And man, that's crippling. And so when you see the campaign that's gone on, and by the way, not only was it just to defame the Germans after World War II, every German was a killer, every German was an anti-Semite, you know, that's a bunch of baloney. But it has stuck with them to the point where now those that had the willingness to speak out are being locked up. There's so many people locked up, it was shocking. Thousands of people in Germany alone, let alone the other, 13 to 17 countries in Europe that now have these anti-hate, inciting racial hatred, or defaming the memory of the dead laws. So I see them trying to do that to the Southerners by making them feel guilty when they see that Confederate battle flag. Not many even people know, or maybe Southerners do, a lot of Northerners don't know the differences between the national flags and the Confederacy. But that being said, maybe it's working, man, because I see in these Black Lives Matter rallies and stuff, you see an awful lot of white people out there. A lot of young white people, and I say that that's fine if that's what they agree with. I love the freedom of speech is the real reason we're in this. We've got to push the bounds of freedom of speech as long as we possibly can, because I have no doubt that as they've done in Germany, they will make what we're doing, which we think what we're doing is telling the truth from the sources, bringing history into court of the facts, but it will be made criminal. Because I don't know whether or not they're going to be able to succeed in bringing down the people of the South, who are a different breed than the people of the North, in my opinion. And I'm somewhere in between, being brought up in Maryland. But unless they can make this talking about uncomfortable or taboo subjects illegal, I think we're going to continue to do it, especially with the internet, which is why we have seen this massive attack by the biggest companies in the world on organizations like the Barnes Review. I don't know whether or not you've had credit card processing canceled or PayPal canceled. I still feel it's okay to talk about Southern history as long as you talk about it without advocating violence or hatefulness. And it's very simple to do because there really wasn't a lot of hate going on there. I don't think Southerners hated blacks. I don't think they hated their slaves. I think just the opposite was true. When I see Southerner blacks and Southern whites interact, they seem to understand that they're both human beings, which is unusual, as I say, in some of the places in the Northeast and elsewhere. But there is a parallel there. And, you know, trying to make, you've got your figurehead of Hitler, of course, in the German era. He has to be the worst, most horrible man in history, because if the truth were to come out that maybe he wasn't quite as bad as the history books say, then all of a sudden a lot of the other lies we were told about World War II will crumble. And so, you know, besides Southern history in this one, and by the way, I don't think about slaves or slavery when I look at the Confederate flag. I don't think many Southerners do. I don't think Southerners walk up to a statue of Robert E. Lee and say, man, I wish you'd won that war because then we could still have slaves. That's a bunch of baloney. It's the last thing we think about when we look at these statues. We may reflect upon the incongruity of a man of his character owning slaves, but we also know that he probably treated them quite well. We know that he broke the law by educating them, et cetera, et cetera. But
Lee only had slaves for a few weeks. What had happened in the case of Lee was his wife inherited some slaves, and they kept them and maintained them for however long it took to free them, and within weeks they were freed, and he gave them all financial endowments and sent them on to live their lives.
You know, I didn't know that. All I knew is he was in violation of some law that he was willing to educate them, right?
Yeah.
So I believe what I think Arthur Kemp believes, the author of March of the Titans and about 30 other books and at least 200 other reprints of books of which he's brought up to date and forwarded, that slavery in general is as bad for the enslaved as it is for the enslavor, especially when there's a racial component to it, because then there's a mixture and you lose your cultural identity inevitably, which is what's happening here today in the United States. But yeah, so the idea that these guys were all horrible haters and everything else, they were products of their times. I mean, we all know Ulysses S. Grant had some slaves and he had a connection with the family, and whether or not he beat them or ordered them around, I have no clue. I just know that that time was a different time. But I do believe, as my point about Arthur Kemp was, Arthur's always said that in South Africa, he's a Rhodesian, I believe, but in South Africa, that system was bound to fail because the minority can never rule the majority, especially in a racial, the number of blacks in South Africa who outnumbered the numbers of white. Not the same here in the South. But I do believe that those who think that if the South had won that war, that slavery would have survived another 25 or 30 years. I mean, do you, Ed, believe that slavery as an institution would have survived even if the South had won the war?
No, and the reason why is if you look at the early acts of the Confederate Congress, they had already passed laws that would have made it illegal to buy or sell a slave, that would have made it illegal to import somebody in as a slave, and that would have made it impossible for children to have been born into slavery. So worst case scenario, when the last of the existing slaves died, the institution would have died with them.
Yeah, and that's my belief. So this idea that they were gonna that this war was about slavery is such a joke. I mean, look at Nathan Bedford Forrest. As any other man, perhaps besides Hitler and maybe Rasputin, had so many lies told about him. Here's a man who allegedly started the KKK but didn't, correct?
Yes.
And he also advocated the bringing of Africans to America as free citizens, I believe. He also was extremely, I think, kind and caring to his slaves, or the idea that there were large numbers of blacks in the KKK in his first incarnation, that there were lots of blacks fighting on the southern side, that there were lots of black slaveholders. I mean, it's not hateful to talk about this stuff. It's not hateful to tell the truth. The truth is not racist. The truth is not anti one religion or another. It's simply the truth. But to be vilified now, and this is where we get into the point about the Barnes Review and Dixie Heritage, too, the very fact that you stick up for those who want to save these statues and make the point that Southerners were not interested in maintaining the institution of slavery well into the future. You know, that would be considered hateful, but it's really not. And so I tell people, because people are worried now, people are worried it is going to become illegal to talk about taboo subjects. We talk about all those at the Barnes Review, of course, as many as we can. But it's okay to ask these questions and state facts. So, like I said, people are a little bit antsy now. I think there's a lot of people out there who understand what's going on, but are simply only place they feel empowered is at the voting booth. I hope that they feel empowered at the voting booth in these next elections, because I think that the country's on a better track with an America First push than we have been with this globalism, internationalism, Barack Obama, multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera. People might even say, well, your dislike of multiculturalism is racial. But I always say, what the left, by the way, the left is so loud and so angry and so violent now, it's not even worth trying to engage on them. But what they're looking for is not diversity. Diversity is different races, different religions, different people, different cultures. And what they want now, I think, inevitably, is the Kudinov-Kalergi plan, right? Where we all inevitably are one mixed race of people, and we all are atheistic, I imagine. And that's not the diversity, that's monotony. And if that's what they're shooting for, what they're shooting for is, I mean, is homogeneity, but homogeneity we are not interested in. At Barnes Review, of course, we believe in the beauty and the sanctity of all the different races. If they want to mix, man, I'm not going to go out there and advocate violence against them. That's their business. But the point is, in the end, for the New World Order's sake, I think it's easier to control the people who have no cultural identity, who have no racial identity, who have no religious identity, who have nothing to tie them to the past. And so it's a scary thing, which is why I think we keep pounding away. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to discuss these topics. You're not hateful. People look at you like you're crazy if you want to just debate any particular point of the Holocaust, for instance, which I think is the number one issue for which you will be branded. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why are they so bent on closing down a discussion of that particular topic? And I would also say, why is it that everybody who flies the Confederate flag is a Nazi? What's he got to do with the Nazis? So they're controlling the narrative pretty carefully now. It is the left that is intimidating people into sacrificing their freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means that you don't get to discuss ideas, which is really a censoring of freedom of thought. And who knows what the next step is. They seem to go in waves. They went in a big wave of canceling all these Amazon accounts and making sure you can't buy the books anywhere on Amazon or Google and all this. You're getting censored out of the search results now, so that the Barnes Review might used to have come up first or second or third on the Google search. I'm not even sure you find them. But I will say this. Our readers understand this. We have about 5,000 subscribers. We'd love to have many more. If anybody wants to subscribe, they can always call us at 1-877-773-9077, toll free. I know you do put a couple ads in there, but I'll make a pitch. It's a magazine worth trying out. I don't think that those in the know, those of a certain age, certain experience, would find what we published to be so shocking. There wasn't much shocking in the Defending Dixie issue that we did. That was the September-October 2017 expanded issue, which has been extremely popular. But it is stuff that you're not going to see in mainstream history books because they're scared to put it in there, scared they're going to be branded something, scared they're going to be branded haters.
Paul, let's pause there for just a moment, and we'll cut to a commercial for our favorite magazine, the Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. We're back with our guest, Paul Angel, and we're talking to Paul about being branded a hater. Specifically, Paul, you had told me that being branded a hater is even worse than being branded a pedophile.
Haters, about as bad. Being called an anti-Semite or a Holocaust denier in particular today is about as bad as being called a pedophile. I make the point on when I talk to people to tell them that if NAMBLA, right, the National Association of Man-Boy Love, that crazy bunch of perverts, I think they are, were to go to Congress with me on one hand, and I'm waiting in the lobby of one of the congressmen, they'd probably be much more willing to talk to that person than they would me
So if we can switch gears and change direction just a little bit here, Paul, what subjects are the ones that interest you the most as an editor at the Barnes Review?
Pre-Columbian contact in the Americas. People laugh at that, but there's a lot of stuff here to indicate that ancient cultures got to the United States. Why am I saying United States, North America, South America? Why am I interested in that? Not particularly to prove that point, but just to show you that we know just about nothing about history, especially ancient history. And with the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, right, a few years back, then we found out that all of a sudden the civilization wasn't 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years old. It was 9,000 or 10,000 years old. Well, the whole history books had to be rewritten. That's the kind of stuff we're interested in. But for all that, and all the years I've been doing this, 25 years in this particular business, I think 40 years as a graphic designer and art director and a marketing person, I'm a Holocaust denier. That's amazing that that's how they've encapsulated my career, simply because I would be willing to publish and or read and or discuss in public my doubts about some of the mainstream depictions of the Holocaust. So, what can I tell you?
You talk about questioning things. One of the articles in this month's issue of the Barnes Review is on the confession of Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant at Auschwitz.
Yes.
And, of course, you talk about how his wife and his sons were kidnapped and beaten within an inch of their life, and he was even beaten and tortured, to extract these confessions. And so how reliable are the confessions?
I don't think they are too reliable. For Rudolf Höss, if you believe the mainstream line, there was this policy to exterminate Jewry. They say that they found proof of this. It's code language. The Germans had met at Wannsee. I think that the final solution was actually a relocation to Madagascar. But a man will confess to almost anything after 45 or 50 days of brutal torture. I looked at the number of Germans who were beaten to the point where I think like 75% of the ones were unable to have children afterwards because of the beatings they took to their reproductive organs. I mean, Rudolf Höss, he didn't just confess to what they asked him about. He began to volunteer stuff. And I think we don't know why. As a matter of fact, Carlo Montagna wrote that book, I believe, and Guillermo Rudolph edited it. In the end, they think he was kind of broken physically and mentally from the constant torture, but also the fact that he knew that he needed to protect his family. And so they didn't pull any punches, so to speak. But there was an article in that last issue I thought, besides, by the way, the Höss is a good one. I think we should have some respect for this guy. I felt like maybe we were a little too hard on the poor guy, because I think you can be broken. But there was another one in there about the Nuremberg hangman I found very interesting, and how this, they had, 11 or 12, maybe 11 high-ranking German officers and politicians and theologians, I guess you might say, or at least thinkers, philosophers, who were, and one was a publisher, right, Stryker, who were sentenced to die. But they didn't want to, nobody really wanted to hang the Germans, they claim. The line is they claim because they were worried that the Germans would come after the executioners. So they found this guy who claimed he had experience in executing people, but there is no evidence that he did. Well, he killed those 11 in the most slow, painful way possible. They were all not hung where you normally would hang them and snap their neck and make a merciful death. And I do believe that even today we understand that when we execute people, there shouldn't be any cruel and unusual punishment, although death in itself is a cruel and unusual punishment. But this guy he used the wrong knots. He wasn't calculating the weight, the drop, nothing. They just strangled, and there's no worse way. Your eyes are popping out. There's blood coming out of your face. You're twisting around there, underneath there for 10 or 11 minutes. This is supposed to be taken. Death of execution should be taken almost instantaneously. But it was the vindictiveness of these guys. And some of them you can't blame. They went out and got a sadist in this case.
Well, his name was Sergeant John C. Woods.
There he goes.
And he had been diagnosed by a Navy psychiatrist as having been a psychopath.
There you go.
And he had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy, and so the question was, how did he even end up in the Army?
Well, there you go. Well, I guess they were desperate. But I thought one of the interesting things, too, was that his services were so badly needed that he knew he could show up anyway. He'd have his hat crooked and his sergeant stripes. He gets his promotion before this, I imagine. But they were held on with just a few little basting stitches of, loosely on his sleeves. I mean, he was a mess. He had no business being there. But the point was, nobody complained because they wanted to see those evil Nazis suffer. That was the way they've been told. This is what they've been taught about the Germans since 1900, and even before to some degree. But they're just like, I never heard that story. So whenever I find a story like that proves a point and that is obscure, I like to run those types of stories.
Of course, you realize, Paul, that these are the kinds of editorial decisions that are getting you branded, as you said a few moments ago, as a Holocaust denier, branding that I know is a false branding, but like you said, once you get branded, it sticks, and it's even worse than being called a pedophile. Anyways, I would like to give you the opportunity to answer the question so that at least our listeners, and I believe that the majority of our listeners, of our Dixie Heritage subscribers, are honest and fair-minded people. And so I want to give you the opportunity to go on the record. Are you or are you not a Holocaust denier?
What do you think? It never happened? Well, of course it happened. I mean, in Auschwitz, the Germans admitted they hung 5,000 or 6,000 recalcitrant concentration camp workers, Jewish mostly, but not all, and that they hung another group of maybe 5, 6, 7,000, but and the records were pretty good, But what you don't have is how many were marched off to the gas chambers, or how the gas chambers worked, or architectural plans for the gas chambers, which is when you come back to Huss. He admitted to it all. There was a final solution. He personally gassed a million Jews, But if I was to say, I don't think 4 million people died at Auschwitz. I think it was only 1.25 million. And I believe it was of all races, creeds, colors, and religions. I'd be a hater. Yet that's what they did with the Auschwitz plaque, right? 10 years ago or so, maybe 20, I don't even know, where they changed that number from 4 million to 1.25 million. Original plaque said, I think, 4 million Jews were brutally exterminated or executed at this house of horrors, we'll say. And believe me, that is paraphrasing. People have to look that one up for themselves. But the new plaque says 1.25 million of all races, creeds, and colors were killed here died here. I don't know if they said killed, died here during the German occupation of the camp or whatever. And so they can say it. They can lower that number by 2.75 million, but I can't. So there's a real double standard going on there. I do object when people start calling it a hoax and a fake and a lie and all this. Listen, that's ignoring the suffering that Jews did go through in World War II. And so if anybody's listening who's never really knows the Barnes Review or knows this subject, may think I'm some type of a lunatic, but there are certain things we do question, and there's certain things we accept about the Holocaust. For instance, that Jews were rounded up en masse, taken with their families, taken their belongings, taken off, put in work camps. We may be making progress. The fact that they changed that plaque meant that they could not sustain that particular exaggeration.
And an interesting thing to note as well, as you mentioned a moment ago, that not all of the prisoners there were Jewish. That's not to say that they didn't suffer and that they were always treated kindly and favorably, but not all of the prisoners in the concentration camps were Jewish. That there were all kinds of other prisoners that were being held in that concentration camp as well.
That was for political prisoners, and they had priests there. They had priests that were against the German National Socialist regime. They had Russians there. They had philosophers there who were on their side. They had a lot of Jews there too. But one of the things we say about the Holocaust is that many more died of disease than did gassing, starvation, and from typhus specifically, than would have ever been possible to have, or even to sustain a claim that they were gassed to death. And so what we see from Dachau particularly is the piles of bodies, these bodies that are being bulldozed, right? Well, the story is that when the war ended, and the Allies came, they found out that at Dachau there was a raging typhus epidemic. Typhus is carried by fleas. By the way, we know this is a fact because more men died in the Civil War from disease by far, right?
Right.
Than in combat.
Yeah.
And so then you're looking at it, and the person says to me, well, what about those piles of bodies they showed the kids? I say those piles of bodies are proof that there was no final extermination plan. Well, how can you say that? The bodies are piled 12 high. I said, they're bulldozing them and they're staying together. This is April. They should be rotted and falling apart. What it means is these people all died within 2 or 3 days, most likely, of this event. Well, then the Allies were already there. The Allies tried to get doctors to go in there. Many of the doctors refused to go into Dachau because of the typhus epidemic. They did not want to die. But so the U.S. government goes and they're like, well, we can't get any doctors to go in there, but we can get photographers to go in there. And in the end, I think more photographers showed up for this propaganda effort than did doctors. They wouldn't let these prisoners, after all this they endured during the war, and believe me, they did endure a lot during the war, all these prisoners, the Jewish prisoners too, of course, starvation, overwork, a lot of 25 to 35-year-old death records say heart attack. Well, most 25 and 35-year-old men don't have heart attack unless they've been overworked and underfed. More photographers were sent there for this, and all of a sudden the myth started to rise. And when you see pictures of human bodies in that number being dumped into pits and being treated so disrespectfully, I guess it was the only way to pick them up, you immediately have that feeling that something really bad happened there. But set aside the emotion and look at the fact. The fact was they couldn't get the doctors to go in. They knew it was raging. They had signs in the area that said, please stay away for a mile because this can be airborne. These lice can be carried.
So blaming the typical citizen for thousands upon thousands of people who died of disease at the Dachau camp, or blaming the rank-and-file German soldier for the thousands and thousands that died of disease, would be just like blaming the rank-and-file Southern citizen for all of the thousands who had to suffer through slavery, or blaming the rank-and-file Southern soldier or the typical Southern citizen for all of the hundreds of thousands of Yankee soldiers who died of disease. To say that those who unfortunately suffered through and died of those diseases were somehow massacred or tortured by the Southerners, I mean, there's a tremendous guilt factor here. We can see how the guilt machine is being cranked up, if you will.
Can they burn 2 million bodies in a week? Can these things be going night and day? Would the Germans have diverted workmen to make sure the rail lines stayed in place, that the wood, which was extremely valuable at the time as well, was put in by the ton to burn these people up, that they would continue in a war that they're losing to dedicate such resources to killing as opposed to defending themselves or defending their own people or escaping is ridiculous. Back to the pile of bodies, and I'll wrap it up at Dachau. What this means is if these bodies weren't rotting at this particular point and holding together as they were putting them in the pits, and they had died very, very recently, the Germans were gone. Unless a few stayed around till the very last second to just kill as many Jews as they possibly could get their hands on. The maniacal German, who's classic from World War I and II, who rapes every woman he can get his hands on, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, since World War I, and it's pretty easy to, by the way, the disappointing thing is, no matter what human population you're talking about, for the most part, but especially in the Western world, we have so much compassion, right? They call it white altruism, right? Pathological altruism. That maybe we feel things that some others don't. I mean, I can't. You got to ask yourself whether or not, how effective it is and how easy it is, to brainwash the public. So when you want to make as Mike Piper, a colleague of mine, Michael Collins Piper, said years ago, that they want to make you the enemy, you'll be the enemy. And overnight, we had this huge German population in America, great German patriots who had fought in many wars, von Steuben and these others, way back to the Revolutionary War era, Germans like the Prussian who fought on the Confederate side, von Bork, right, who had massive contributions that Germans have made to this country. The number of German inventors and scientists, et cetera, et cetera. But man, overnight, the American public was convinced through Hollywood and through the media that every single German was just a horrendous person. That's the scary thing. Okay, that's the scary thing, is that overnight they convinced you about that every person who flies a Confederate flag has got to be this, not just a racist, but I mean an evil racist who talks about this at home to his family and his children, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the really scary thing, is how easily the masses can be manipulated. And I'm hoping, looking at what I see on television, because I do have to watch the mainstream media here and there to see what the enemy is saying, is how incessant they are. The never-ending assault on this particular bogus narrative. It's scary, man, because if it goes on, and again, I think it goes in waves. You give them what they can take and what they can digest, then you let it sink in, and then you start a whole new wave of this. I imagine this is kind of...
I'll tell you what interests me about the Holocaust more than anything. Part of it was touched on in this issue, and part of it you had even touched on early in our discussion, is I see in the Holocaust story a tool that has been effectively used by the socialists, by the globalists, by the Marxists, by the establishment, if you will, to basically vilify and keep in perpetual guilt an entire nation of people. And if you go to Germany, you know, the Holocaust, every day it's put in the faces of the school children so that they literally grow up ashamed to be German, and they're going to spend the rest of their life doing everything that they can to atone for the sins of their ancestors. And now we see the same thing happening in the United States with this slavery narrative, is that the American people as a whole, but Southerners in particular, if they're white especially, are going to have to perpetually apologize and atone for the fact that slavery existed as an institution in this country once upon a time.
Yeah, and I ask you, if in fact that war, the American Civil War, we're jumping around, but that's okay. The American Civil War, I'll call it, though. People object to that. There's 10 names for it. We'll call it the war between the states. If the war between the states was all about slavery, then that means that every Union soldier who fought was fighting to free the slaves. Where is the memorial for 350,000 or more Union soldiers who sacrificed their lives to free the slaves? It's an awful lot of guys fighting to free the slaves. But there won't be any discussion of that. That was to be expected. Of course you should have done that. That was the moral thing to do. You should have freed us many, many years ago. And, of course, they gloss over, you'll notice in the Defending Dixie issue, we did have a couple articles from a guy named Robert Grooms, who seems to be like the national expert on white slaves and also black slave owners. And he had a couple very powerful pieces in there about some of the largest, I think the third largest slaveholder in New Orleans was a black man who held lots of slaves. Or the fact that Amistad, the movie about the poor enslaved black man who fought himself out to freedom, became a slaver after that. So listen, man, slavery is not the sole property of white people. We know it also in this last issue that we put out in March, April, that we discussed the war of the Europeans, with Belgium in particular, to wipe out the Arab slave trade in the Congo. People have, when I talk to people about slavery, I say, so you mean we white people ran into the woods in the malaria-infested place with crazy beasts in there and snakes and everything else to go get these blacks? No, they were brought to us by the other tribe. They were already slaves, mostly. But the people that the Arabs took were not. They went all the way to England, to Ireland. I think they made it to Iceland. They nearly depopulated areas of the Dalmatian coast. There was millions of white people who were enslaved. Mm-hmm. So I am one who has a funny idea about reparations. I believe we should pay blacks reparations for slaves, and I think we should take it out of our foreign aid budget. At least the money is going to stay in the United States.
Well, did you ever read the story of St. Patrick?
No.
St. Patrick was captured as a slave. You know, you talk about these Moors would sail up the coast and capture slaves. And so he was captured as a slave and taken to Ireland. And he wound up escaping from slavery, coming back home, becoming active in the church, had his time of conversion, and then after much prayer went back to Ireland as a missionary.
Okay.
But he was a white man who had been taken into slavery. And that's the part of the story that everybody seems to miss.
Well, it would also, but on the other hand of the reparations thing, how far do you go back? I mean, should Christians be suing the Italian government for the Romans feeding us to the lions?
Yeah.
I don't know. By the way, it's the real arbiters of hate who are the real enemies here, because they're as corrupt morally and intellectually as the people that they allege are the haters. And one of those is the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, by the way, I just want to tell people that there's a pretty good article on dailycaller.com about how the Southern Poverty Law Center attacks and terrorizes conservatives. But this is a first-hand account from a former member of Congress, and his name is Peter Hassan. And actually, it's Trey Radel. I think Hassan did the article. But I think we need to stop listening to people. We need to come out and expose these people as much as we can. Only the truth is really going to stick and eventually come out. But the Southern Poverty Law Center and Defamation League, to some degree, I think they're much more interested in the anti-Semitism thing. Matter of fact, I think somebody from the ADL.org just signed up for our weekly newsletter. They like to make sure that we're not being anti-Semitic, so that if we are, they can call up our credit card processors, because we have a limited credit card processing ability now. We've lost a lot of money to American Free Press and Barnes Review from this attack. We've been lucky to survive, but only because the people that read these publications understand their value and understand that we're trying to do something, like you are, that very few people are willing to do these days. I mean, look, man, if in fact they're going to brand me a Holocaust denier, I've seen so many teachers fired recently for pro-white views, or personal stuff. They don't bring it in the classroom. I ask you, Ed, are your children or my children going to be able to run for public office in this country? Or will they be tarred with the sins of the father? Now, that's a horrible thing. And if you look at my writings and you look at the Barnes Review, you can discern for yourself whether or not things are written in a hateful thing. We try to present the facts. But how far are they going to take that into? How many generations? Will it be your grandfather, your great-grandfather, your great-grandfather? Well, they've already done it with the Southern leaders. So the people that everyone is convinced are haters are just putting out what they know is the facts, but also their personal opinion. Last time I checked, this was legal in America if you weren't advocating violence against someone. But right now, everybody is scared. Everybody's scared that their children are going to pay for the truthfulness, or at least the willingness to discuss the very contentious topics today. I've never seen such a vindictive, hateful agenda as that of the left right now. And much of it is organized by guys like George Soros. I can't say he's behind it all. And guys like Morris Dees, who have, 40, 50 million, 200 million, 300 million stashed in offshore accounts. I think one expert on the 501c3 nonprofits says at the Southern Poverty Law Center they've never seen such a divestment of assets as they have done in the Caribbean. And here they are. Morris Dees is kind of a weirdo anyway. I don't know how he got up to the top of this chain, but if you look at his own divorce records, it's interesting reading about some of his behavior. How did this guy become this arbiter? Who is propping him up? Who's funding him? Well, that's just it. Let's say somebody gave TBR, Barnes Review, $5 million, and we were going to fight this, because, by the way, we are bringing a lawsuit currently against the credit card processing company that put us on the match list. The match list is the list that prevents you not only from you lose your existing credit card processing, but also make sure that you never get one again. And when people listen to me, they say, well, you talk an awful lot about the business angle of this stuff. Man, listen, this is an expensive business. Putting out a newspaper, putting out a magazine, having a real office, paying your writers, paying your radio show hosts what you possibly can. Most people are doing 10 times the amount of work for the pay they get for us, but it's an expensive business. And you look around you today, and you see the Washington Post couldn't make it without its Kaplan Education Department. The American Spectator couldn't make it without money. I think Taki's organization, what's the name of that magazine he's got, the Rich Greek fellow, good guy, got some good hard-hitting stuff in there. I don't think his magazine could make it today unless he had millions of dollars to push into it. So we are a group that is really just a bunch of average people. We do have a lot of stringers and writers who are experts in their particular fields. But this is a business that is going to be hard to maintain with the financial boycott that we have seen. And so we do talk about this stuff because with a company is struggling to break even, and that's all we want to do because there's no assets, there's no money. The good thing about our organizations is there's no debt either. We haven't taken out massive loans. But if you can't pay your staff to answer the phone, you can't pay your staff to enter in the credit card numbers or fight a credit card case, then you're out of business. And that's it. It's as simple as that. There's no billionaires behind this, no millionaires behind this to bail us out, nor do we have some other business interest that is funding this. So money is important. People should support these independent organizations like Dixie Heritage, like the Barnes Review, like American Free Press, with as much as they possibly can, because if you don't, I don't know how we're going to survive. Right now we lost, and again, for a company that is struggling at the Barnes Review to break even, and it's not like, by the way, that without $1 million in the bank, you really can't reach out to people. They'll find out about you maybe on the internet. But people coming on the internet, they want stuff for free. They might buy a book or whatever. And you might find somebody who wants to give you a little bit of money. But it's difficult to do what we used to be able to do in the 80s and 90s, which was afford to mail out large promotional mailings. It might cost you $30,000-$40,000, but you might get 1,000 subscribers out of it. Nowadays, it's direct mail is different. It's still effective, but it's expensive. Everything's expensive. So when I look at what we lost at the PayPal, we had $15,000 in PayPal, which is probably enough to pay for an issue and mailing of the Barnes Review, but still a significant amount of money because we only do 6 a year. They took the money and they held on to it for 6 months. We had lawyers contact them, but that's their policy, and they held on to that money, and we got hurt. We had a Kindle account in which we were bringing in $4,000 to $5,000 a month. That has now been canceled, and we're not allowed to sell on Kindle anything that has to do with race or the Holocaust. That was more money that we lost. We lost our credit card processing. Only through the support and donations of people who understand the importance of an independent, a truly independent media, have we been able to survive. So I hope anybody listening will, and I'm not asking or begging for money. What I'm asking for is subscribers. Just try it. It's $56 for a year, I think, of the Barnes Review. And we'll throw in a book, we'll throw in anything you want, just to get subscribers, because more people need to read, more people need to hand it out, more people need to know the truth. Scarily, many years we were trying to prepare ourselves for our transition to the web. We always want to have our print publications, but we thought, well, we've been doing pretty well. We should be able to make some money and pay for our writers and pay for our rent and pay for the printing of the publications. I can't say anybody at American Free Press or the Barnes Review are making it rich off this place, especially with the hours they work. But anyway, we figured, okay, great, that's going to be great. Man, the internet is there. This is hot. Everybody loves it. Well, wow, we found how quickly that could be taken down.
The internet is a precarious thing, and it's definitely not the bastion of free speech that we all thought it was going to be 20 years ago. On that note, let's break to a word from our sponsor, the American Free Press, and then we'll be back with Paul Angel, editor of the Barnes Review magazine and contributing editor of American Free Press. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And we're back with our guest, Paul Angel, the editor-in-chief of the Barnes Review magazine. Paul and I were talking about the internet and how it's being censored in ways that we never would have thought imagined just a few years ago. And so the internet is not the bastion of free speech that it once was, and the censorship is only going to get worse, probably before it gets better, if it ever gets better at all. And so that's why print publications like the Barnes Review are more important now than they have ever been, probably within the last 20 years or so. Paul, why don't you tell us just a little bit about why subscribing to a print publication like the Barnes Review is so important in this digital internet age?
But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the stuff on the internet can be wiped out with the push of a button. At least you have your physical issues to save forever on your bookshelf and show to posterity. Because I also doubt very highly that within the next 5 years, we'll probably be squished down on the internet. But that does all depend on the groundswell of support. And I think people are getting it. I mean, have you converted anybody in your time with Dixie Heritage? Have you had people who didn't like you at first and who like you now? Have you had any luck with proselytizing, I'll say?
We have, actually. There have been some.
Well, that's good news. But if you can't reach the people, you can't reach them effectively, and organizations like ours are going to be blacklisted out of existence, well, that's a real shame, because all you're going to get is the opinion of the mainstream left. And that's what it is, because deny it if you like, but the people who own the major media networks and the television networks and the radio networks are all, for the most part, leftists. People think Fox is a conservative group. I don't think so. But maybe they do a little tiny bit better job. I think they're just trying to grab a chunk of market share. But, it's important. It's important because we're at a very important time now where what we're hearing, talk about fake news. I understand they invented the fake news to use against us, but Trump helped. And I must say Trump, well, whether we agree with him on every single thing he does or what his background was or how he is on Twitter, it's been important, his presidency, because we have been able to talk about these things. We've seen it more so than ever, that the fact of what you're getting on mainstream television news specifically, although it's just cookie cutter and it's the same thing on the radio, is a pack of lies. It is a pack of lies. You know this from what you know about Charlottesville, the rally in Charlottesville. That what you heard about that was absolutely unbelievable. Trump was almost like run out of office just for saying that there might be two sides to that story. And of course, and you know what? After all these years, I even fall for it sometimes. I heard that this woman, Heather Heyer, had been run down by this crazed maniac racist. And I'm like, well, there are some racists out there, pretty nutty sometimes. Maybe that wasn't the story, right? She had a heart attack. He didn't run into her specifically, I don't think. And we now find out that their guy on the left is taking credit from Antifa, one of the Antifa organizations, for threatening him with a gun and running after him. The kid was scared. I'm not going to justify what he did. But the fact of the matter is, my only point is, what you saw in the news was so different than reality that if you rely on those venues for your information, you have made a terrible mistake. You have to at least be able to know what's going on.
It looks like we are out of time, but there is one thing that I would like to state for the record, especially as we were talking a few moments ago about what happened at the Dachau camp, is that when the Allies came into Germany to liberate the camps at the end of the war, those were not U.S. soldiers that were liberating the camps. They were Soviet soldiers. Let me repeat that. Soviet soldiers who were liberating the camps. And the Soviets murdered, massacred, murdered thousands upon thousands upon thousands of prisoners. Most of them were Jewish. Some of them were not. But the Soviets murdered as many or more than the Germans did. And a lot of honest historians have attempted to document that fact through the years. Of course, it doesn't fit the official narrative. And I think the reason it doesn't fit the official narrative is that you have to remember that the Soviets were the United States' allies. And so our government does not want to have to justify why it was allied with a maniacal butcher like Joseph Stalin. Paul Angel failed to make that point, so hopefully I've made it now. But we are out of time. I want to thank you, Paul, for being our guest today. I want to encourage you to go to the Barnes Review website. Check out the Barnes Review. It's a great magazine. You will love being a subscriber. I know I look forward to reading it. I did long before I went to work writing for them, and I know you'll look forward to reading the Barnes Review as well. Go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. Get a free copy of our book. Subscribe to our newsletter. No cost or obligation. So until next week, thank you again for being one of our listeners, and God bless you.